Today I want to explain how I believe personality disorder works. We're not talking about a set of symptoms, we're talking about the mechanism underlying those symptoms. I'm not pretending that this is a scientific hypothesis. What it is a logic thought experiment that produces an outcome that I believe is similar to how a personality disorder appears. So it gives us a form of hypothesis about what the structure underlying a personality disorder is. There are two elements to this. The first is that a human inverts the cause and effect of an emotion. And the second is that we have the ability to misidentify an emotion. I'm concerned with what the consequences are of those two things happening simultaneously, and by working through that possibility, looking at it purely as a logic exercise, I think we can produce an outcome that looks an awful lot like a personality disorder. So let's take those two elements. The first is that a human inverts the cause and effect of an emotional state. I've got a more detailed video on this, which I'll put in a link in the description. But the essential idea is that in an animal, hunger causes the animal to go and seek food. And we can therefore say that hunger is the cause of seeking food in an animal. But because a human understands that and understands the concept of future hunger, a human will calculate how much food they have to produce now in order to offset hunger in the future. So instead of hunger being the cause and seeking food being the effect, we've got seeking food being a calculated output where the effect is that we do not have hunger. So obviously the invention of agriculture, for example, required us to have a concept of hunger at least 6 months in advance. So, as I say, there's a much more detailed video on this, which you might want to refer to. The second element is the possibility of misunderstanding or misidentifying an emotional state. When you experience an emotion, you naturally have a behavioural display associated with that emotional state. The biological function of that behaviour is it acts as a signalling device between two members of a social group, and it is evolved in the sort of pre-verbal phase of animal life. So if we look at herds of elephants, they will communicate with one another through behavioural cues. They will indicate to each other when they're in distress, when they have need, when they identify an opportunity. That will be a behavioural thing. It has an evolutionary origin, and even though humans communicate with language, they still retain that behavioural signalling. Because humans understand this, they manipulate the behaviour tactically. We are concerned here with the suppression of emotional behaviour. When you suppress emotional behaviour, you lose the ability to identify the existence of the emotion. You lose the ability to know that the emotion is there, and therefore you lose the ability to identify the emotion. Now, this can happen on multiple different levels. It can happen across an entire society. So in America, people tend to suppress anxiety behaviour because they don't want to appear like a loser. And in a lot of Asian cultures, people tend to suppress anger behaviour. It can also happen at the level of a family. So you might live in a society that's not generally anger suppressing, but you were raised by parents who believe that showing anger is a demonstration of weakness, and therefore one should not show anger. And therefore, within the culture of your family, anger is generally suppressed, and your parents will teach you to do that, and you will learn to do that in your childhood. So that then, as an individual, you can learn ways of suppressing emotional behavior that are just unique to you. That can be because you suffered abuse or neglect in your childhood, you developed your own coping strategy, it was a response to a traumatic experience. For whatever reason, you, as a child, could teach yourself or could learn to suppress an emotional behaviour. Now, there is some evidence that people with personality disorders were discouraged or punished for demonstrating emotions in childhood, and therefore they have learnt to suppress emotional behaviour. When you suppress emotional behaviour, you lose the ability to identify that emotion in yourself. If you live in a society where people generally don't do that, you have the ability to identify the emotion in other people, but you do not recognise that you experience that emotion in yourself because you do not demonstrate the behaviour that other people demonstrate. Let us imagine now that you are doing this for 2 or more different emotional states. You're suppressing the emotional behaviour, and that means that you have the inability, to identify that emotion in yourself, even though you may have the ability to recognise that emotion in other people, because other people are not suppressing that emotional behaviour. That means that there are 2 or more emotions that you are failing to identify in yourself. Now let us say that you experience some kind of traumatic moment in your life. You will experience an emotional state as a result of that. It may be an emotional state for which you have learnt to suppress the behaviour, and therefore you do not have the ability to identify the emotion that you experience. There is the possibility that you could think, oh, this is emotion X, where really another person would recognise it as being emotion Y. So you have a traumatic moment, you misidentify the emotion that ensues, and you will remember that traumatic moment. So let's go back to this other point, that a human inverts the cause and effect of emotion because you have the ability to predict future circumstances, and you will normally predict what emotion would result from those circumstances, and you can calculate what you need to do to offset that. Let's put these 2 things together. You have a concern that there might be a repetition of this traumatic moment. You have a concern that that might happen in the future, and therefore you want to prevent it happening. And therefore you're going to try and calculate the action that you have to perform now in order to offset the chance of that emotional state arising in the future. You're trying to negate a negative emotion before it arises. And you're doing that at the same time that you misidentified the emotional state. That means that you're going to calculate the wrong thing to do now. So let's just think about this in the long term, because here we just got one instance of you're calculating the wrong action when you anticipate a future traumatic moment. But what that means is that you do not have an effective strategy for negating this traumatic moment when it arises. You are predicting a possible future traumatic moment. You're trying to offset it. You do not have a strategy for affecting it. And that in itself is going to induce a sense of panic because you have a moment of powerlessness. You're anticipating a future traumatic event. You have no effective strategy for offsetting it. That is because you're misidentifying the emotion that will arise from it, and you're calculating the wrong offsetting mechanism. That means that you will then develop a pattern whereby you will produce responses that are inappropriate to the threat that you face. And you'll do that on a repeating basis. Now, let's put ourselves in the position of being a therapist of this person. This is a person who produces odd responses, but you can't see what they're in response to, because the thing they're in response to is not an event. It is an expectation of an event. They are concerned about an event occurring in the future, and they're computing the wrong response to it. The therapist cannot see what the response is to. The second thing then you do is you ask the patient, why are you doing that? But you're asking the patient why they're doing that when the patient is misunderstanding the emotion that's going to ensue from the thing that they fear. So they might say, let's just try and work through an example here. If we look at antisocial personality disorder. Neither the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the World Health Organization officially separates antisocial personality disorder from psychopathic personality disorder. They merge the two together. I think these are two separate personality disorders, but I understand that they're difficult to distinguish diagnostically. Let us imagine that a person misidentifies shame as anger. So in circumstances when they would be ashamed, they think that they experience anger. The reason this is happening is because they're suppressing the emotional response to both of those behaviours, and they lose the ability to correctly identify them, and by some happenstance or accident or some suggestibility that occurred in their past, they've gotten the wrong way round. Shame is supposed to prevent you performing antisocial actions. But when a normal person would feel shame, they experience anger. Anger is a biological mechanism for punishing people that cheat in social obligations. So at a time when you should feel moral restraint, you feel that the way to offset this is to punish a person for performing an antisocial action. That is what we call antisocial behaviour disorder. It is the inappropriate displays of anger where the trigger for that anger is quite difficult to see. So let's talk a little bit about psychopathy now. Psychopathic personality disorder, I believe, is when a person misidentifies shame as humiliation. There is a school of thought, I guess you could say, that a lot of psychiatrists think that a woman cannot be a psychopath. That's a touchy subject because it sounds a bit sexist, but the humiliation revenge response is a biological mechanism that arises because a male cannot be sure that its offspring are its own, and therefore they tend to be very territorial around females. The humiliation revenge response evolved as a mechanism whereby if a male's biological fitness is threatened, it responds to that threat with violent response. If we are competing for a female, two males are competing for a female, one male reduces the chances of that male breeding with the female, the male who is being put down will violently respond. This is what we call the humiliation revenge response. When a person confuses shame and humiliation, when they experience what another person would recognize as shame, they see it as humiliation, then they will respond with a violent response. They will respond with a violent response against what they see as a threat that isn't really there. Psychopathy and antisocial behaviour disorder are two different responses. One is an inappropriate anger response, the other is an inappropriate revenge response. From a symptomatic point of view, they are quite difficult to distinguish. And that's the reason I think that when we're looking at it from a diagnostic point of view, these two things tend to be merged into one. But that's just an example of how a personality disorder might arise. One other example is paranoid personality disorder. So the two examples we gave before, somebody was confusing shame with either anger or humiliation. Let's put this the other way around. Let's say that there's another emotion, doesn't matter particularly which one, which they are confusing with shame. In other words, when they anticipate a particular future event, they think they're going to experience shame, and they're trying to offset that experience. So they will have fearful moments where they will think that they're going to experience shame when really they would experience an emotion that somebody else would recognize as something different. That will manifest itself as a sort of drawing in, like thinking that other people are accusing them of things, thinking that they're being criticized when they're not being criticized. And this is a particular set of behaviors that we generally call paranoid personality disorder. It comes about because a person is taking a moment that a normal person would recognize as a different emotional state and they think that the emotion that they experience is shame. They are misidentifying an emotion and they're trying to offset that emotion arising at a future moment. That's all I'm going to say for now. This is just a basic overview of how I think personality disorder works in general. Two elements to it. The first is that we predict future emotions and we try to calculate the action that we perform now in order to produce an emotional outcome in the future. We're doing that at the same time as we're misidentifying an emotion, which means that in response to a predicted future event, we're calculating the wrong action now to offset that event. We don't have an appropriate strategy for offsetting that event in the future, which means that we have a sense of powerlessness regarding our ability to offset that, which exacerbates, causes a cycle whereby we keep producing an action that is inappropriate to the circumstances that we face. That is what I believe that we call personality disorder. That's all I'm going to say for today. Thank you.